Okay, so welcome to the third part of the Romans series. In the first one, I did an introduction. I'm basically covering the fact that we're going to talk about Romans from the perspective that everything that Paul said, he meant. And that's particularly in reference to Romans 2, 5 through 8, because a lot of Christians don't know that they're going to be judged on the last day by their works. They don't like it, especially when you've never heard it, when you've heard something alternative to that. But that is exactly what Paul says in Romans 2, 5 through 8. If you do a search on YouTube for Romans 2, 6, you're going to find a bunch of videos that say Romans 2, 6 doesn't mean what it says, or that Paul didn't mean it when he said it. But we're going to see that Romans is read best when you just believe what Paul says. It's not confusing. It is step by step, this fantastic exposition of knowing God, being saved by faith, being will cover the rest of it. It's just amazing as you go step by step through Romans the proper way. As I said in a previous video, part two, um, that reading Romans this way, where you believe what he says instead of putting your evangelical doctrine into Paul's mouth and writings, then things are just better, and you end up agreeing with what the church taught back in the first, second, and third centuries when they were together, united, believing the same things. Now we're all divided up, and somehow we think that we understand Romans better from our perspective rather than from the perspective that Paul wrote it from. You can't interpret Romans by beginning by going, oh, he didn't mean what he said in Romans 2, 5 through 8. That's just crazy. So we're not going to do that, but that doesn't really apply to this video. It's going to probably be kind of a short one because I have a brief thing that I want to talk about from Romans 1, verses 15 to 17. So the text says, so I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So just a little bit of background. When Paul wrote to the Romans, part of the reason was because the Emperor Claudius had put all the Jews out of Rome from AD 49 until 54, the years 49 to 54. No Jews were in Rome, so that meant not the Christian Jews either. And Paul wrote this in either 56 or 57. So it had only been a couple of years since the Jews, including the Christian Jews, had come back to Rome. So it's not really a surprise that there were still some misunderstandings of what Paul taught, some objections to his saying that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised. And so he's addressing that in this letter. And in these verses, you can see he's going first, he goes, listen, I'm not ashamed of my gospel. I'm going to defend it. I'm not, despite what's being said about what I said, what I've taught, he mentions in at least in Romans 3, and I think again in Romans 6, that there are people slandering him and slandering his gospel, misrepresenting his gospel. Those things went on then, just like they do today. And so he's trying to, this is what I teach, and it's for Jews and Gentiles alike. And I'm not ashamed of what I teach because. So why is he not ashamed of the gospel? Because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So, for as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So, the the point I want to make is that when he says it's the power of God for salvation and that he's not ashamed, he is making it clear that my gospel changes people. You Jews are, and me a Jew, the Apostle Paul was a Jew. We love the law, and I will defend the law, as you will see throughout the letter. Paul is always defending the law as something great and right, teaching holiness and teaching all that. The problem that Paul is solving in Romans is not the law. He's solving the problem of us. Faith is the answer to changing people's lives. The law is not. That's what he focuses on throughout this letter. So he's going, my gospel changes people. When he says the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, he's saying that when one person believes and the next person believes, you begin to see God's righteousness manifested in them. People are changed. They're doing things that glorify God. It's a righteousness that comes by faith in God rather than the righteousness that comes from the law, because the fact is, no righteousness is coming from the law, but that's for the next video. Right now, he's just saying, I'm telling you that my gospel of faith produces righteous people. So my first point is that the revealing of the righteousness of God for the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. That revealing is that just that's what the word means. Revealing the righteousness of God means that people can see the righteousness of God being done by other people. And so then I do want to cover, again, this is going to be a short video, but this is the big thing I want to cover. This is imparted righteousness and not just imputed righteousness. Now, so imparted righteousness is God giving you the ability to live righteously so that you do live righteously. Imputed righteousness is God treating you as righteous, even though you haven't done any righteousness yet. And so my point this verse is talking about imparted righteousness. He will go on to talk about imputed righteousness in Romans 4, but the two go hand in hand. You should never read anything in the New Testament, but especially Romans, without knowing 1 John chapter 3, verse 7. So John tells us that only those who are doing righteousness are righteous as Christ is righteous. And he adds that we're not to be led astray about this. The exact quote is, let me see if I can get this right. Little children, let no one lead you astray. The one who does righteousness is righteous as he is righteous. So if you're not doing righteousness, you're not righteous like Christ is. You don't have imputed righteousness. And the fact is, if you don't, as we'll see in the rest of the letter of Romans, if you don't have imputed righteousness, you're not going to end up doing righteousness either. They go hand in hand. Jesus brought us both. It begins with imputed righteousness. When you believe, and I'm getting ahead of myself, which I don't like to do because Romans is very step by step. When you believe, you receive imputed righteousness. You are set completely right with God. Your past is gone, and you are in the favor of God. Okay, but that the only person once that happens, the favor of God will begin transforming you. So John says, if you're not doing righteousness, you don't have the imputed righteousness of Christ. You can go look that up, 1 John 3:7. Okay, the other scriptures I want to cover is the other places where Paul says, I'm not worried about saying the right things or sounding fancy, which a lot of people nowadays are. I explain how you're saved even though you can't see it. Paul's like, no. 1 Corinthians 2:4. My speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So Romans 1:16-17, he's going, I'm not ashamed. The power of God comes when I preach the gospel. People become righteous. I want you to be, he says in Corinthians, I want your faith to be in the demonstration of spirit and power that comes from the gospel of faith. So 1 Corinthians 4:18 through 20. Some are arrogant. So there's people going, no, I follow this guy, I follow this guy, I follow Peter, I follow Apollos, I preach better than Paul does, etc., etc. Paul goes, some are arrogant, as though I were not coming to you. But I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I will find out not the talk of these arrogant people, but their power. By the way, all of this is in the uh, English Standard Version, but you're not going to find any differences in other Bibles, just real minor ones. So I will find out not the talk of the arrogant people, but their power. For the kingdom of God does not consist in talk, but in power. So is their gospel producing righteous people? If it's not, then that's a problem. And I want to argue that yes, sometimes the gospel preached in America produces righteous people, but a lot of our practice is not powerful. It's people sitting in a pew and going home and living relatively ordinary lives, um, just and often living with pet sins, not having power. There's things we have to change. So then again in 2 Corinthians 3:1 to 3, Paul says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Now, here I want to point out that God does not need letters of recommendation, He knows everything. Letters of recommendation are written to people. And Paul says, you, Corinthians, are my letter from Christ, delivered on tablets of human hearts. I can point to the Corinthians and go, despite all their problems, they're living righteously. They are walking in the power of God. They do not fall behind in any spiritual gift. They are touched by God because of my gospel. That's my boast. And that's why he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ that I preach. My gospel of faith results in visible transformation of human beings. That is a testimony, a demonstration of the power of God inside of human beings. So that's all I really wanted to cover in this video. If this series has been helpful, then please click the subscribe button, and I thank you for listening to this.